was the genius physicist Albert Einstein who said, "Anyone who has never made a mistake never tried anything new." And I guess the inventor of the revolutionary theory of relativity should know. From a forgotten backyard invention that helped win a war, to the technological breakthroughs that forged the global age, I want to uncover not just the triumphs, but the trials and tribulations behind the light bulb moments that have transformed our world. My first time travel is taking me to Lithgow, a sleepy town in central western New South Wales. It's the last place you'd think to look for some cutting-edge innovation, but a century ago, that's exactly what you'd have found. At the beginning of the 20th century, when all the Australian states joined together in a federation, one of the big problems they had was what were they going to do about the defence of their new country? The Brits just assumed that they'd continue to buy their weapons. But why would the Australians want to do that? They were young, they were independent, they wanted to set off on their own course. In 1899, Australia sent off its troops to fight the Boer War in South Africa. But with no armament supply of their own, they soon ran out of spare parts and ammunition for their weapons. The government solution was the Lithgow Small Arms Factory, which was opened in 1912. The glory days of this factory may be long gone, but back in the Second World War, this place looked like this, with machines operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the activity wasn't limited to just here. There was a feeder factory in Bathurst down the road and satellite factories all over the area. In World War I, 100,000 weapons were produced here. In World War II, it was more like 1 million because, ironically, the arms were being made not just for the Australians, but for the British as well. But until World War II, the factory was still making predominantly British-designed weapons. Until the arrival of this. Kerry, this isn't a modern weapon, is it?
No, Tony, this is the Owen Gun. This was made in 1944.
Who was Owen?
Evelyn Owen, he was a soldier working in the Australian Army, and he designed a prototype for the Owen Gun. And he tried to put it through the government. The government was not interested, so he went back to war.
So if he went back to war without his gun, how come people are firing it nowadays?
He'd left it in a shed in the backyard. A neighbour found it and took it to Lysar's Engineering in Port Kembla.
Here, the simple genius of Owen's prototype was finally recognised. Can we have a go on one of these?
Yes, I can fire it if you like.
OK, yeah. And in a twist worthy of a boy's own adventure, Owen was recalled from the front line to develop his backyard invention. But before it could go into production, the Owen submachine gun had first to prove itself in a series of tests against the British and US equivalents.
When they did tests, they did a whole lot of trials with it and the Sten gun and the Thompson submachine gun, and they put them in snow, in the dirt, in sand, and it kept going, the others failed. It was very simple to manufacture, it was simple to make, it was very, very reliable.
And the Americans wanted it too, didn't they?
They did, they all loved it.
Components for the Owen gun were made here in Lithgow, and many came through the factory for modifications and repairs. By the end of the war, 45,000 Owen guns had been produced for use in the harsh jungles of Papua New Guinea. The weapon created by a soldier for his fellow soldiers would continue to see active service
for another 20 years.
Walking through the skeleton of a factory that had once been so successful can be pretty eerie, although it does vividly bring to life the cyclical nature of an industry based on war. And now, how many people are there here? Just over 120. Seems a bit sad, really, doesn't it? Mind you, let's hope this factory never, ever has to go again into full production.
For good or bad, war has historically been the catalyst for many significant inventions, including the most controversial of them all, the atomic bomb. But on my next time travel, I'm going back to the 1890s to discover a very different driver of innovation: water. In the late 19th century, the Western Australian city of Boulder, Kalgoorlie, sprung up out of the ground with the discovery of gold. Half of Western Australia moved to the goldfields. But with no fresh water supply, no sooner had the diggers struck lucky with gold than they were struck down with disease. Enter the state's chief engineer, C.Y. O'Connor. In 1895, he was charged with fixing the water crisis. And his solution? The longest freshwater pipeline the world had ever seen.
This was going to be a massive pipeline going all the way from Perth right through to Kalgoorlie. A really audacious piece of engineering. 556 kilometres of steel pipes, 8 steam pumping stations and 2 enormous dams were built to push the water uphill from Perth to Kalgoorlie. And it would cost a fortune. They were going to have to borrow £2.5 million from London in order to get the money to build it. Nevertheless, after 5 years of trouble and strife and arguments, it finally reached Kalgoorlie, the tap was turned on, and the town, at last, had its own fresh water. But the celebrations on January the 24th, 1903 were tinged with sadness. So, Mike, there was one person who wasn't here who should have been, wasn't there?
There was, yes. My great-grandfather, Charles Yelverton O'Connor, the chief engineer of West Australia.
And he wasn't here because?
He killed himself 10 months before the water arrived.
Why was that?
Well, it was the real stress of the job had really finally got to him. And a month before, the Sunday Times, there was an article in which mentioned words like corruption and this Shire engineer and greasing his palm and all those sort of things he knew were wrong.
So why did they think that?
Well, mainly because it's a huge project and no one really understands it. And so they start looking at reasons. The first story was, the cement isn't good enough, it'll come down and Perth will be flooded, and then the pipes, the quality is inferior, and any intelligent person, including the chief engineer, could see that, said one anonymous source. So he had all this sort of pressure going on.
And none of this is true?
None of this is true. In fact, after he died, very soon afterwards, when they looked at his books, they found out he had less than 200 quid to his name. He never owned property. I mean, he had a big family, he had 7 kids, but he would be very cautious about going out and mixing with people in case it was seen as he was greasing his own palm, which he never did. The sad thing is that within months of him dying, all that criticism disappeared.
OK, O'Connor was treated really badly in his lifetime, but at least we now know the truth. And what's more, he's now celebrated as one of the outstanding engineers in Australia. And this pipeline, along with the Snowy Mountains scheme and Sydney Harbour Bridge, are now celebrated as three pieces of major engineering that transformed Australia.
In the face of great adversity, O'Connor achieved astonishing feats. So just imagine what's possible with a bit of goodwill and collaboration. I'm now heading back in time to the 1880s to uncover an alliance that would light up the globe. I've come back home to London. Here in 1883, two bright sparks forged a partnership that paved a way for the electronic age we know today.
I've come to Ponder's End and I've brought this with me, an ordinary electric light bulb. You may be wondering why. Well, the birth of the light bulb was fraught with difficulty. Inventors found it pretty easy to put an electric current through a little piece of wire so that it glowed and provided a light. Only problem was the light didn't last for very long. That is until two inventors, Thomas Edison in America and Joseph Swan in England, came up with a solution. Problem is, they both came up with the same solution independently of each other at the same time.
Rather than fight a long court battle about the invention of the light bulb, the two men formed a company together. It was called Ediswan. They set up shop in the Lee Valley. The filament they'd invented to solve the problem of their bulbs not lasting very long created another problem. The bulbs turned black quite quickly. So they called in Professor Ambrose Fleming to find out why. By creating a device that measured electronic waves, he discovered that minute particles of carbon from the filament were sticking to the glass. His groundbreaking research device was the dawn of a new high-tech era. It was called a diode valve.
So how significant was the diode?
What's so important about this, and don't let your eyes glass over, this is the first time in the world that we have the control of a stream of electrons by an electronic means. Therefore, you can say that all the electronic gizmos that we have today, radio, television, space communication, Bill Gates and his computers, the internet, whatever, came out of the centre of the universe, Duckley's Lane, Ponder's End, just over there in those buildings.
That's extraordinary. And of course, television, that was developed in this area, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And in fact, the valves for the Alexandra Palace transmitters up there on the western slopes.
The home of the BBC.
Home of the BBC, the first public service broadcast of television in the world where everyone learned their trade. They got the valves for the transmitters. They were Edison valves from here. It's like a technological relay, isn't it? You run round the track, you pass on to the next generation your knowledge, and then they develop it further. So from this thing, which looks quite simple, you develop all these other wonderful things.
So Ponder's End was the Silicon Valley of its time, wasn't it?
It sure was.
Nobody in that cafe was aware of the significance of this factory.
Although there is, in fact, a small blue plaque up there that tells the story. You've got Joseph Swan up the top, Ambrose Fleming down the bottom. In the middle, someone I didn't mention, James Dewar, who invented the vacuum flask. There was an awful lot of activity going on around here. But one person who isn't there is the American Thomas Edison. Still, it's a British plaque. They probably just forgot.
Ambrose Fleming's diode valve was a critical step on the road from the industrial to the digital revolution. But who says all innovation has to be on such an epic scale? I'm now fast-forwarding to the early 20th century, when an act of exceptional culinary creativity took place. It's thought that in 1901, the Queensland capital of Brisbane was the birthplace of an Australian innovation that revolutionised the high tea. Excuse me, ladies, is it all right if I butt in for a minute? Do you have any idea which piece of food on this cake stand was invented here in Queensland?
Lamington.
You're absolutely correct. This beautiful thing. But do you know why? No? Well, it was named after Charles Wallace Alexander Napier Cochrane Bailey, who was otherwise known as... Lamington, Lord Lamington.
okay.
See, you do know stuff.
Yeah.
He was the governor of Queensland at the turn of the last century. And the story goes that when Australia became federated, he threw a very late party, and his chef, who was called Owen Gun, hadn't got enough food. So he poked around in his pantry, and what ingredients do you think he came up with? Coconut, which nobody knew could be part of something posh in Australia in those days. And we found a huge amount of old vanilla sponge left over from the previous day and dipped the whole lot in chocolate. And the guests thought the whole thing was really exotic and it was incredibly celebrated. And the chef named it after his boss, Lord Lamington, as you so rightly said. Although I don't think Lord Lamington was that impressed by them, because he referred to them later as these bloody, puffy, woolly biscuits. Can I have this?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you for sharing your tea with me. Pinch one of these as well. Enjoy yourselves.
Thank you.
Australians might not agree, but it's probably fair to say the creation of the Lamington wasn't exactly life-changing. So next, I'm spinning forward a decade to discover an invention that really did transform the world. If there's one thing that spurred on innovation in Australia more than anything else, it's this: the tyranny of distance. Just look at it. Even today, the space between the cities on the island continent is vast. In 1910, Australians weren't just isolated from the rest of the world, they were isolated from each other. But suddenly, the way forward was obvious.
And just...
The first successful flight by an Australian in Australia took place in a plane almost identical to this, and we're going to try and recreate that moment.
While the Wright brothers were grabbing all the headlines around the world, there was movement at Mr. and Mrs. Dygan's property, Spring Plains, in Maya, Victoria. Their two sons, John and Reggie, were tinkering with a contraption they'd more or less copied from a postcard. And while American upstart Harry Houdini had already stolen their thunder by claiming the first powered flight in Australia, the Dygan brothers built and flew the first Australian-made plane on the 16th of July, 1910.
What's so significant about the original Dygan flight?
It was the first flight, powered flight in Australia, built by an Australian. Nobody in Australia had started from scratch. He made every bracket himself and every bit of timber and designed the unique suspension and a few other things. Their ailerons unique, because at the time they were just warping the wing instead of having the ailerons. After that, there was no more wing warping, and they all had the ailerons, or flaps as we call them, behind the wings. So much Australian history is under the carpet. We pay a lot of homage to overseas history, kings of England and all that sort of thing. But when I went to school, I never heard anything about the first flight designed by an Australian who did everything himself.
Our pilot today is nearly as old as aviation. 74-year-old Ben Buckley.
Where do you want the plane, Ben?
I want the plane right there,
Yeah,
so as I can get the best angle into wind
yeah.
and the best slope.
You a bit scared?
No, but I'm apprehensive, and I'll be in full consultation with the Almighty, I can tell you.
And you're letting your dad do this?
I can't stop him. He's been doing this sort of thing since I was knee-high to a grasshopper.
What do you have to watch out for?
Well, I'm not quite sure yet. I'm a bit like...
And they've got a vital role for me to play. They know not what they do.
So what I've got to do is I've got to run along, but this may go down. So when I'm running along, I've got to try and keep it up in the air as well. So you're running.
Yeah. Let me get this jalopy started.
So we're about to make or break history.
Oh, this, believe it or not, is the oh god, it's the starter key. The heavy old thing. And I have to line this up. Go on, Ben. Get us out.
That's it. Contact.
Houston, we have a problem.
You right? Yeah. We got it off, didn't we?
I don't think so.
Why? Why did it veer off?
Because you didn't lift the wing properly, man. In my report, I'll blame you, Tony.
That dung heap saved your life, mate. You'd have been in an ambulance if it hadn't been for that.
Well, I've been in the shit a few times, Tony, but he's been on my side this time.
It was.
Eh?
Makes you realise what a strong team Digan must have had, and what a lot of effort, skill, know-how, and indeed what a lot of luck he must have had, because I tell you, one gust and this whole thing goes wrong. He managed to fly a kilometre, we got one wheel off the ground and ended up in that stuff.
If there's one thing I've learned from this time travel, it's that innovation doesn't come easy. Whether it's overcoming technological challenges, vast distances, or hostility, from light bulbs to Lamingtons, inventors risk it all so that we can enjoy the benefit of their ideas.